Hi guys, I hope you're well and welcome to episode 157 of the James Layton Fitness Podcast. Now in this specific episode we'll be discussing, do you need to consume carbohydrates immediately after training? Before we get stuck into the podcast though, I just want to tell you we're up to just over 98,000 downloads since starting the podcast. So I just want to say thank you very much for those who have listened and downloaded to a lot of the podcasts since we've been doing this just over 2 years now, I believe. So thank you very much for the support, and we should be reaching that 100,000 download target within the near future. So thank you if you've been an avid listener over the years. So let's get stuck into the podcast. So do you need to be consuming carbohydrates immediately after your training sessions? This is a common fitness idea. People believe that you need to be consuming high glycemic carbohydrates immediately after the training session. Now, first we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture and actually consider context. Context is really critical when deciding whether we need to do something with our nutrition or training. And the consideration we need to think about first is what type of training we're doing and whether we're training twice per day or once per day. Now, if you're training twice per day and you're performing endurance type training, then speed of glycogen resynthesis between session 1 and session 2 is extremely important. Within this specific context, it absolutely would be worthwhile consuming carbohydrates immediately after session 1 to replenish glycogen as quickly as possible to help fuel your second training session of the day. In addition to that, if you're doing endurance training sessions, this is even more important. However, for most of you listening to this podcast, most of you are just training once per day and you're doing weight training and a small amount of cardio. Now, within this specific context, it's not absolutely paramount to have carbohydrates immediately after the training session, because ultimately glycogen replenishment will take care of itself by default at the 24-hour mark, as long as you have sufficient carbohydrates throughout the day. So within this specific context, for most of you listening to this podcast, it's not absolutely paramount to have carbohydrates immediately after the session. Just make sure you're getting in sufficient carbohydrates, you're meeting your carbohydrate target, you're meeting your daily calorie target as well, and protein target before the end of the day. If you do this, by default, glycogen replenishment will take care of itself for your next training session 24 hours away and beyond. So that's such a critical thing to remember, as mentioned, when you're looking at these nutrition and training principles, is really considering the context. So as mentioned, if you're training twice per day within 8 hours, then glycogen resynthesis really is imperative, and having carbohydrates immediately after that session 1 is extremely important. Additionally, it's also worth pointing out that if your goal is fat loss and muscle gain, if your goal is fat loss or muscle building, then energy balance is still king. So within the fat loss phase, the whole goal is to essentially consume calories to create the calorie deficit by the end of the day. That's really your main focus, is having sufficient protein and then calories set to essentially create the calorie deficit need for fat loss. And then on the flip side, within the muscle building phase, we need to be creating that calorie surplus, and therefore your sole goal is consuming sufficient calories to create that calorie surplus needed for growth. So essentially, in short, do you need to consume carbohydrates immediately after training sessions? Well, it really depends. If you're training twice per day, then yes, it is very important to have carbohydrates immediately after session 1 to fuel your second session of the day within 8 hours. But if you're training just once per day and you're just doing weight training, a small amount of cardio, simply focus on just consuming sufficient carbohydrates within the day, making sure that you're consuming your carbohydrate target by the end of the day, and therefore glycogen replenishment will take care of itself prior to your next session, at least 24 hours away. So hopefully this has been useful. Hopefully this has busted through some pre-existing ideas you may have been following, but again, it really depends on context whether it's absolutely paramount to consume carbohydrates immediately after the training session. With that being said though, it's still worthwhile getting protein in relatively close to the training bout. So the reason why is we want to halt protein breakdown and then kickstart muscle protein synthesis. So it's worthwhile getting a protein dose in relatively close to your workout after the training session. Something to consider. But with regards to carbohydrates, again, just like your personal preference, dictate when you consume carbohydrates throughout the day, as long as you're consuming sufficient carbohydrates before the end of the day. So thank you very much for listening. If you're still yet to subscribe to the podcast, please do, so you don't miss a podcast episode. And if you're still yet to download my free ebook, How to Set Up a Nutrition Plan, if you go to James Layton, Layton fitness.co.uk, you'll see a tab at the top of the page called free ebook, and that will teach you how to set up a nutrition plan. So thank you very much. I'll speak to you next week. Take care.